Imagine a scenario where suddenly, nearly half of the population disappears. People fall ill within days, entire cities are abandoned, and fear spreads faster than the disease itself. It seems like the plot of an apocalyptic movie, but it was a reality that devastated Europe in the 14th century. The Black Death, the largest pandemic of the Middle Ages. Between 1347 and 1351, this calamity not only wiped out millions of lives, but also deeply shaped the economy, society, and culture of the time. In today's video, we will explore how this tragedy began, how it spread, and the marks it left on human history. The origin of the Black Death traces back to the vast steppes of Central Asia, particularly the regions that today comprise Mongolia and its neighboring areas. This region, characterized by intense interactions between nomadic populations and traders, provided fertile ground for the spread of diseases. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the plague, resided in fleas, which in turn infested wild rats. These conditions, combined with heavy trade traffic, created the ideal environment for the pathogen's propagation. The starting point of the pandemic is often linked to the siege of Kaffa, an important Genoese trading colony located in Crimea. In 1346, Mongol forces were besieging the city, and stricken by the plague, they employed a terrifying strategy. They catapulted infected corpses over the city walls, attempting to contaminate the defenders. Genoese merchants who fled the siege carried the disease to European ports, such as Genoa and Venice, in 1347. This marked the beginning of devastation in Europe. The spread of the plague was driven by the major trade routes of the time. The Silk Road, a network connecting Asia to the Middle East and Europe, played a key role. Merchants and caravans transported not only goods, but also rats infested with fleas carrying the disease. Once the plague reached European ports, maritime trade ensured its rapid dissemination. Port cities, such as Marseille, Messina, and Constantinople, became centers of transmission, spreading the disease inland via land and river routes. Population mobility also contributed to the advance of the pandemic. People fleeing affected areas in an attempt to escape the plague ended up carrying the infectious agent to new regions. Within a matter of months, the disease crossed borders, reaching northern Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, and even the British Isles. The rapid human movement, combined with poor sanitary conditions and high population density in cities, caused the plague to become a pandemic of unimaginable proportions, devastating entire communities in just a few years. This impact was not limited to Europe. Other regions, such as the Middle East and North Africa, also suffered severely from the spread of the disease, reinforcing its truly global nature. The Black Death is, therefore, a historical example of global interconnectedness, illustrating how trade and human mobility can amplify the reach of a disease. The Black Death manifested in a terribly varied way, presenting three main types: bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic. Each of these forms had unique and equally terrifying characteristics, amplifying the fear and helplessness of the populations facing the pandemic. The bubonic plague was the most common form, named after the painful swellings called buboes, which appeared in areas where the lymph nodes were concentrated, such as the groin, armpits, and neck. These swellings could grow to the size of an apple and often turn black due to skin necrosis. The disease was transmitted by infected fleas, which jumped from rats to humans, creating a devastating cycle. If untreated, the mortality rate of bubonic plague was around 60%. The septicemic plague, less frequent but even more deadly, occurred when the Yersinia pestis bacterium entered directly into the bloodstream. This type of plague caused extremely high fevers, bleeding, and black spots all over the body due to the failure of the circulatory system. With an extremely rapid progression, septicemic plague was almost always fatal, usually killing in less than 24 hours. There were no visible buboes, which made its diagnosis at the time even more difficult and terrifying. The pneumonic plague, on the other hand, was the most contagious of all, as it could be transmitted directly from person to person through airborne droplets. This type affected the lungs, causing high fever, chest pains, coughing up blood, and often death within a few days. Its airborne transmission allowed it to rapidly infect large groups of people, especially in densely populated areas, such as cities and villages. The mortality rate was almost absolute, ranging from 95% to 100% without any treatment. In the absence of proper medical knowledge or effective treatments, medieval communities could do little to confront these three types of plague. The understanding of the time was based on theories such as corrupt air or divine punishment, leading to desperate attempts at prevention, such as burning aromatic herbs, isolating oneself in makeshift quarantines, or resorting to mystical practices. Even so, none of these measures were sufficient to contain the devastation, leaving populations at the mercy of one of the greatest tragedies in human history. The demographic impact of the Black Death was utterly catastrophic, marking one of the greatest tragedies in human history. Between 1347 and 1351, it is estimated that the pandemic caused the death of 25 to 30 million people in Europe alone, representing between 30% and 50% of the continent's population. In some regions, mortality was even more severe, with entire rural areas and villages being completely abandoned due to the death of all their inhabitants. Densely populated cities such as Florence, London, and Paris were particularly devastated. It is estimated that in Florence, for example, around 60% of the population succumbed to the plague. In London, more than a third of the inhabitants died within a few months. The rapid spread of the disease in urban environments, compounded by poor sanitation conditions and the lack of medical knowledge, turned these cities into true apocalyptic scenes, with bodies piling up in the streets and cemeteries unable to cope with the constant flow of the dead. In rural areas, where the plague also claimed mass victims, the consequences were equally dramatic. Entire villages were left deserted, and vast stretches of farmland were abandoned due to the death of the peasants who worked them. In some regions of Europe, such as northern Germany and Scandinavia, it is estimated that nearly 80% of smaller villages completely disappeared. This population collapse created a demographic void that took centuries to fill. In some areas, the pre-plague population density was only reached again at the end of the 15th or early 16th century. The loss of so many lives not only destroyed families and communities, but also destabilized the social and economic foundations of medieval society. Without enough labor to sustain agricultural production and the feudal economic systems, Europe plunged into a deep crisis that affected all aspects of life. Furthermore, the lack of people to fill essential roles and care for properties generated an internal migration phenomenon. Survivors moved in search of better opportunities, leaving some areas even more depopulated, while others faced the arrival of new inhabitants. This exodus also helped spread the disease to regions that had not yet been affected. Therefore, the demographic impact of the Black Death was not just a matter of numbers, but also a structural transformation that profoundly altered European society at the time. The Black Death caused an unprecedented economic impact, profoundly altering the structure of medieval society. With such a high number of workers dying, labor shortages became one of the greatest challenges faced by feudal lords and landowners. This scarcity of workers made survivors more valuable, leading to a significant rise in wages and strengthening the bargaining power of peasants and artisans. In some cases, workers who were previously subjected to near-slavery conditions found themselves in a position to demand better working conditions, paving the way for a shift in the relationship between serfs and lords. Agriculture, which was the foundation of the feudal economy, was deeply affected. With fewer people to cultivate the land, agricultural production suffered a sharp decline, resulting in food shortages and, in some regions, famine. The reduced supply of agricultural products also led to inflation, making basic food items inaccessible to many. Lands that were once productive were abandoned, and vast rural areas became uninhabited, further exacerbating the disintegration of the feudal economy. At the same time, the breakdown of the feudal model was accelerated. Many landowners, desperate to maintain production, began offering incentives such as lower rents or even freedom to attract workers to their properties. This phenomenon contributed to the gradual decline of serfdom, replacing it with a more wage-based economy and leasing contracts. In some regions, peasants had the opportunity to ascend socially, acquiring land or becoming independent. In commerce and in cities, the impacts were equally transformative. The death of merchants, artisans, and consumers temporarily reduced economic activity, but also created opportunities for survivors. Urban workers were better compensated, and the scarcity of products led to innovations in production and trade. At the same time, the population decline meant that many guilds and corporations relaxed their entry rules, allowing more people to enter the labor market. This period of economic crisis also had long-term effects that went beyond immediate losses. The redistribution of wealth and the increased value of labor helped lay the groundwork for the transition to a more modern market economy. For example, changes in the agricultural sector, such as the abandonment of less fertile lands and the diversification of crops, began to shape a more efficient and sustainable economic model. Therefore, despite the initial devastation, the Black Death played a paradoxical role in the economic development of Europe. The collapse of the feudal economy and the emergence of a more empowered working class marked the beginning of a new economic and social era, paving the way for the transformations that would culminate in the Renaissance and the rise of capitalism. The social impact of the Black Death was profound and devastating, marking one of the most chaotic periods in European history. The fear of the disease, compounded by the lack of understanding of its causes and the high mortality rate, threw cities and villages into a spiral of panic and disorder. Without a scientific explanation for the plague, people saw justifications in beliefs and prejudices, creating scapegoats that led to brutal acts of violence against minorities. Jews were particularly targeted, accused of poisoning wells or conspiring against the Christian population. They were persecuted in various regions of Europe. In some cases, entire Jewish communities were exterminated, as in Strasbourg, where hundreds of Jews were burned alive in 1349. This persecution not only worsened the social situation, but also revealed the fragility of the structures of coexistence between different religious and cultural groups at the time. At the same time, rumors and superstitions emerged, leading populations to carry out extreme acts of violence or devotion in the hope of protecting themselves from the plague. The breakdown of the social fabric showed in other ways too. Families were broken apart, and community support, which had been important in many villages and neighborhoods, was replaced by individualism and survival at any cost. Many left sick relatives and friends behind, fearing the spread of the disease. Although this abandonment was understandable because of the situation, it caused emotional and psychological isolation for the survivors. The exodus from cities to rural areas was another significant consequence. As the plague spread, many people believed that the countryside, less densely populated, offered greater protection against the disease. This movement disrupted urban life and further weakened local economies. However, this migration did not always mean safety, as the disease continued to spread through travelers and trade networks. While some chose to escape, others isolated themselves at home or in small groups, trying to avoid any contact with the outside world. This voluntary isolation, while effective in some cases, also generated anxiety and despair. Many believed they were at the mercy of divine wrath, while others gave in to hedonistic behaviors, such as parties and excesses, in an attempt to make the most of the time they had left. Additionally, extremist religious movements began to gain strength. A prominent example was the flagellants, groups of penitents who traveled through cities, self-flagellating in public processions to atone for humanity's sins and supposedly appease divine wrath. While these acts of collective faith provided a temporary sense of control, they often contributed to spreading even more panic and possibly the disease itself. To summarize, the Black Death not only claimed lives, but also shook the foundations of human relationships and social structures. The chaos that ensued exposed the vulnerability of medieval society, while the behaviors of flight, violence, and isolation revealed the psychological impact of living in an era marked by constant fear and uncertainty. These social impacts left deep scars, some of which would resonate for centuries, shaping the way communities would reorganize in the post-plague period. The Black Death did not only affect the physical health of the population, but also had a profound impact on the religious and cultural spheres, causing a crisis of faith in many people and altering the artistic and intellectual expressions of the time. The Catholic Church, which was the main religious institution in medieval Europe, was severely challenged by the plague. For centuries, the Church had been seen as the pillar of explanation for natural events, diseases, and calamities. However, the Church's inability to provide effective answers or prevent the spread of the disease shook the popular trust in its authority. The Black Death seemed to be a divine punishment for the world's sinfulness, but the fact that both the faithful and the clergy were equally vulnerable to death made many question God's justice and power. This feeling of disillusionment led to a widespread crisis of faith. Many began to see the Church as powerless in the face of calamity and sought answers from other sources, including mystical practices and superstitions. The flagellant movement is a notable example of this search for a spiritual explanation for suffering. These groups formed processions of penitents who publicly and severely self-flagellated, believing that their personal pain would be a form of atoning for humanity's collective sins and thus avoiding divine punishment. Although the flagellants were initially an expression of faith, their practices generated controversy, and they were seen by the Church as heretical, resulting in persecution and prohibition. Furthermore, the plague also fueled the growth of other forms of popular religiosity, such as the veneration of saints, relics, and healing practices, using elements considered mystical. With the increase in mortality and the sense that life could end at any moment, many people turned to more personal and less institutionalized spiritual rituals, seeking protection against the plague. In art and literature, the Black Death had a lasting effect. Before the pandemic, medieval art was largely dominated by religious themes and the vision of a harmonious and ordered world, with a clear focus on eternal salvation. However, after the plague, many artists began to explore the theme of death in a more direct and somber way. More realistic and macabre representations of human suffering emerged, such as the famous Dance of Death, an allegory that depicted death as an equalizing force, taking both nobles and commoners without distinction. Death became a recurring theme, reflecting widespread fear and the acceptance that human life was fleeting and unpredictable. Literature also adapted to this new worldview. Works such as Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written shortly after the plague, portray the social and cultural consequences of the pandemic, as well as human behaviors in times of despair. The book is a collection of stories told by a group of young people who flee the plague in Florence, showing, through their narratives, the diversity of human reactions to suffering and imminent death. Additionally, art began to focus on the fragility of life and the inevitability of death, creating an atmosphere of introspection and contemplation. The representation of the human body became more realistic, and suffering, which had previously been softened by the spirituality of the time, became a visible and inevitable expression in art. These cultural changes marked the beginning of a new approach to life and death, which would continue to influence European art and philosophy for centuries. In summary, the Black Death was not only a health crisis but also a spiritual and cultural crisis. It provoked a deep questioning of the role of the Church, the meaning of life and death, and the relationship between man and the divine. The responses to this religious and cultural crisis, which manifested in popular movements, artistic changes, and new forms of religiosity, helped shape the transition to the Renaissance, where the pursuit of reason and the exploration of the human and natural world would take the place of simple obedience to the divine. The response to the Black Death, as expected in an era without advanced scientific knowledge of infectious diseases, was marked by attempts at control that often reflected more fear and superstition than medical efficacy. The lack of understanding about how the disease spread and its true nature led authorities to adopt measures that, although early and experimental, did not always have the desired effect. One of the first and most notable responses was the implementation of quarantines. The term quarantine comes from quaranta, which means 40 in Italian, due to the 40-day duration that ships and travelers had to remain isolated in ports before entering cities in an attempt to prevent the spread of the disease. Port cities such as Genoa and Venice, in particular, implemented these measures in the late 1340s, establishing isolated zones for the infected. Although this practice helped restrict the movement of people and goods, it was not effective in completely preventing the spread of the disease, as understanding of how the plague spread was still in its early stages. Another important element was the use of plague doctors, professionals who became iconic figures of this period. These doctors were easily identifiable by their heavy and grotesque outfits, with beak-like masks, usually filled with aromatic herbs such as lavender, rose, and camphor. It was believed that foul odors, known as miasmas, were responsible for transmitting the disease, and the use of perfumed substances was an attempt to purify the air and drive away these toxic vapors. In addition, doctors also used vinegar and other substances, such as essential oils, to disinfect the environment or the bodies of the infected. Although these measures were largely based on superstitions and erroneous theories, their popularity persisted during the pandemic, as they represented the authorities' attempt to provide some psychological relief and control over the situation. At the same time, various isolation practices were established, not only in ports, but also within cities. Authorities in many areas ordered the closure of shops, churches, and other public spaces in an effort to limit social contact. Infected families were often confined to their homes, with doors sealed to prevent the disease from spreading to neighbors. The sick were often left to die without proper medical care, as treatment practices were ineffective and hygiene conditions were poor. Despite all these efforts, the effectiveness of these measures was limited. Movement control, while reducing the spread in specific areas, did not prevent the plague from spreading across all regions of Europe. The idea that the disease was transmitted by miasmas, or flea bites from rats, was not understood until centuries later, which prevented the development of more effective interventions, such as rodent control or the use of antibiotics. The lack of a structured healthcare system and limited communication between different regions of Europe also hindered the coordination of a more uniform response to the pandemic. The responses to the Black Death, however, also gave rise to some practices that persisted over time. The concept of quarantine and the idea of isolating the sick, for example, became more common and more sophisticated in subsequent pandemics. The plague also left legacies in the evolution of public medicine, demonstrating the importance of public health interventions, such as controlling contagious diseases and monitoring at-risk areas. In summary, although the responses to the Black Death at the time were limited by the lack of scientific knowledge, these measures reflect the efforts of authorities and communities to control an unprecedented crisis. The attempts to isolate, purify, and restrict the movement of people were the first steps toward the development of public health practices that, centuries later, would help confront future pandemics more effectively. The Black Death was not just a sanitary tragedy, but also a historical milestone that redefined European society in profound and lasting ways. The impact of the pandemic was not limited to the immediate chaos caused by mass death. It drove transformations that reshaped the social, economic, and cultural structure of Europe for the following centuries. One of the most significant legacies of the Black Death was the decline of the feudal system, which had sustained the socio-economic structure of Europe for centuries. The death of a large proportion of the population, especially peasants and serf workers, resulted in a labor shortage. This altered the power balance between feudal lords and workers, as the few survivors began to demand better living and working conditions. The scarcity of workers also led to wage increases and the weakening of local lords' power, as they could no longer enforce servitude contracts as rigidly. This phenomenon facilitated the movement toward a wage-based economy, a fundamental transformation for the transition to modernity. As feudalism began to crumble, cities grew, trade intensified, and new economic models began to emerge. The growth of trade and nascent industries led to the strengthening of the merchant class and the rise of new forms of social organization, paving the way for the rebirth of capitalism in Europe. Although the Black Death did not immediately bring improvements in health conditions, the crisis exposed the flaws in the medieval healthcare system and planted the seeds for future sanitary and public health reforms. The inability to control the plague and the massive mortality led over time to a growing interest in hygiene practices and the control of contagious diseases. The first quarantines, the isolation of the sick, and the control of high-risk areas were implemented during the pandemic and continued to be refined in the following decades. Mass death also generated greater awareness of the importance of personal and collective hygiene, something that, although rudimentary in the years immediately following the plague, influenced the creation of new public policies related to health and sanitation in the late Middle Ages and early modern era. This would be crucial for the development of more effective public health systems, especially in the 19th century, when cholera outbreaks and other contagious diseases required a new understanding of disease transmission and the importance of cleanliness and sanitation infrastructure. On a philosophical and cultural level, the Black Death had a profound effect on how humanity began to view life, death, and mortality. In a deeply religious society, the pandemic challenged the traditional view of suffering as divine punishment or a test of faith. The inability of the Catholic Church to provide effective responses or explanations for widespread suffering undermined its authority in many respects, contributing to a rise in religious skepticism and the emergence of new philosophical and spiritual currents. Furthermore, the Black Death generated deeper reflection on the fragility of human life and the inevitability of death, themes that were reflected in the art and literature of the period. The cultural movement known as the Renaissance, which began to gain momentum in the decades after the pandemic, emphasized a more individualistic and humanistic view of life, with a renewed appreciation for reason, science, and humanity's ability to shape its own destiny. Death, once seen as a certainty imposed by divine will, came to be viewed with a greater awareness of human suffering and the transience of existence. This new focus on human individuality and the value of personal experience also influenced the development of the sciences and the arts. The revival of visual arts, with a greater focus on the human body and nature, and the growth of rationalist and empirical philosophy, which would give rise to modern science, can be seen in part as a reaction to the grim landscape left by the plague. The loss of lives on such a vast scale also had consequences for social and political structures. The scarcity of available workers and the population reduction led to a reorganization of class and power relations. Local authorities began seeking new ways to ensure order and social stability, often through more authoritarian policies or reforms in labor laws, which attempted to contain the demands of peasants and urban workers. This period of restructuring social systems was also marked by an increase in political and social movements. The weakening of feudalism opened the door for the strengthening of centralized monarchies and the rise of nation-states, which, over time, would seek greater control over issues of public health, the economy, and population mobility. In summary, the legacy of the Black Death was immense and multifaceted. The pandemic not only altered the social and economic configuration of Europe, but also promoted a profound cultural and philosophical reassessment, laying the groundwork for changes that would define modernity and the beginning of the contemporary era. The lessons learned from this catastrophe helped shape Europe's trajectory in the following centuries, from advancements in public health practices to changes in the view of humanity and its role in the world. The Black Death, which devastated Europe in the mid-14th century, not only deeply marked history, but also left a lasting imprint on popular culture and collective memory, with curiosities that continue to fascinate to this day. One of the most intriguing and frequently mentioned curiosities when talking about the Black Death is the famous English nursery rhyme, "Ring a Ring o' Roses." Many people believe that this song has roots in the pandemic, with each part of the lyrics supposedly symbolizing the symptoms and events associated with the plague. The most common interpretation is that the ring of roses refers to the rashes that appeared on those affected by the plague, which were often red and rosy. The line, "all fall down," would be an allusion to the sudden death of those who contracted the disease, while the smell of vinegar, which was used as a rudimentary attempt to purify the air and avoid contamination, would be reflected in the words, "I think I sneeze." However, this interpretation has been widely debated. Historians and scholars of popular culture warn that the rhyme may be a much more recent creation, originating only in the late 17th or early 18th century, well after the major outbreaks of the Black Death. Nevertheless, it continues to be associated with the historical event, exemplifying how the memories of great tragedies can be passed down from generation to generation in a playful form, even if somewhat distorted. Persistent outbreaks until the 18th century. Although the peak of the Black Death occurred between 1347 and 1351, the disease did not completely disappear with the arrival of the 15th century. In the following years, Yersinia pestis, the bacteria responsible for the plague, continued to claim victims in various parts of Europe, although the outbreaks were smaller and less frequent. These events were known as great outbreaks and occurred at irregular intervals, such as in 1361, 1374, 1400, and 1466. The fact that the plague continued to resurface over the following centuries is a reminder of the difficulties medieval societies faced in dealing with infectious diseases, especially when the mechanisms of transmission were not properly understood. It was only in the 18th century that the plague epidemics began to disappear, with improvements in sanitary conditions, reduced human mobility, and, finally, more effective control of rats and fleas. During this period, advances in public health practices became more evident, with the development of more sophisticated quarantine techniques and monitoring of outbreaks, which helped contain new occurrences of the disease. Cultural and linguistic impact of the Black Death. Another curious aspect of the Black Death is the lasting impact the pandemic had on linguistics and cultural expressions. Several terms and phrases associated with the plague have survived through the centuries. For example, expressions like "dying of the plague" or "dying of bubonic plague" have become part of popular vocabulary, often used figuratively, but with an origin dating back to this catastrophe. The very term plague became synonymous with any major calamity or crisis, illustrating how ancient societies, such as those in the 14th century, gave profound and lasting meaning to their experience with the disease. In art, the presence of death and suffering during the pandemic also left a mark that was reflected in the cultural and artistic productions of the time. Medieval painting and literature, especially the Dance of Death, began to explore the theme of mortality and the relationship between life and death in a more visceral way. This aesthetic phenomenon helped consolidate a new cultural view of death, something that would be reflected in the transition to the Renaissance and in new philosophical and scientific approaches to humanity. The plague and the development of the sciences. The Black Death also played an indirect role in the evolution of medical sciences. Although medieval medicine was limited and unable to understand the nature of the disease, the continuous contact with epidemics led to greater attention to medical research. Doctors and scholars began to formulate theories about contagion, which led to the greater development of quarantine practices and isolation measures. While these measures were rudimentary and not always effective, they marked the beginning of a more systematic and organizational approach to combating diseases, something that would be further developed in the following centuries. In this way, the history of the plague is not only about its catastrophe. Over the centuries, it has been a constant source of cultural and scientific reflection, serving as a mirror of human fears and challenges. As time goes on, the memory of the Black Death continues to be a narrative that, surprisingly, reflects not only suffering and fear, but also the human attempts at adaptation and resistance. The Black Death was much more than a mere human tragedy. It was a turning point that deeply reshaped the structure of medieval society. By decimating entire populations, it not only affected economies and beliefs, but also accelerated social, political, and cultural changes that reverberated for centuries. The impact of the pandemic shaped the course of history, from the fall of feudalism to the emergence of new perspectives on life and death. And, curiously, many of the legacies of this era can still be observed in aspects of the modern world, such as public health approaches and views on death in art. Now, we'd like to know your opinion. Did you imagine the true extent of the Black Death's impact on Europe? How do you think it influenced the course of history in other parts of the world? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell to not miss more fascinating content about history. See you in the next video.